So this person says, I feel like I'm behind in life because of all of these years of bipolar disorder. I feel like I'm not meant to have a normal life. I can't function at a high level. I wish I could have a lasting relationship and a full-time job like everybody else. How do you deal with all the lost years due to your bipolar disorder?
This one's a tough one. I'm not so sure the writer will like my answer either. I don't dwell on it. I can calculate that I've had 10 lost years, 5 very bad, the first 5, but the first 10 were very bad. And over those 10 years, I was prescribed 24 psychotropic medications, mostly at the front end. So that shows how unstable I was, that the psychiatrist kept trying different combinations. In those days, I was on cocktails of drugs. It wasn't unknown for me to be on 6 or 7 drugs at a time. And so those are lost years. And I just find that if I were to dwell on them, it would ruin the time that I have now. They're done. There's nothing I can do about them. And I very much try to live in the present because the past wasn't so great. And I don't know what the future holds. And so I live in the present. And I really feel it would take away from what I'm experiencing now. So I just don't dwell on the lost years. In terms of not being able to function at a high level, I certainly don't function at the level that I used to. And what I've done is I've tried to lower my expectations. And that's another way of being happy. I used to be a really huge overachiever. And so by lower my expectations, then I find I'm more content. And an example of that would be when they're talking about work. I had a job that by the time I reached my mid 50s or early 50s, I was at the peak of my career, and I had a lot of people underneath me that I was managing, and it was very stressful. I remember I used to go into the bathroom and cry, and I just couldn't handle it. And then one day, and I wondered what I'd do. I wasn't working out. And then one day a posting came by. I'm a social worker, and a posting came by for a job in social work. And it was a lesser job, and it was at a salary of $10,000 less a year, which is a huge, huge deduction in salary. And I took it because I just wasn't functioning. And it was the best thing I could ever have done. I loved that job. There was less stress. I didn't have to apprehend children, which I always found a horrific thing to do. And I enjoyed it. And that was my final job. I stayed in that job until I finished working. And so I think that people have to be creative. If they can't work at their level or don't think they're working at their optimum level, or they can't do their job, I think they either have to do something like I did, get a lesser job, but I was still in my profession. At one point when I was suffering and struggling with the depression, I didn't have employment, and I worked in a cafe with the MSW to support my children. So I was really not functioning in the work world at all. So I lowered my expectations, and that made a big difference. And in terms of relationships, I systematically destroyed my marriage. And also the severe, profound depression I had when I was suicidal also destroyed my marriage. It just picked away at it until there was nothing left eventually. And so now I've been in a stable relationship for 12 years, common law. And the only reason I'm in that stable relationship is because I'm stable. And I wouldn't have been the same person if he had met me as I was then. I wouldn't have been able to maintain a relationship with him either. And so I had to work on my stability. It all gets back to working on stability. And what I would suggest to the writer is that there's so many things that they can avail themselves of nowadays. There are webinars, there's podcasts, there's quality of life tools, there's peer support work, support groups. I could go on. And the more that they avail themselves of these services, I think more stability they will have. And then they won't incur any more lost years. And when I was diagnosed in 1991, I was living in a town in England, and they had none of those things. So that's why my journey has been so solitary. There were no support groups. I had never even spoken to someone who had bipolar disorder. And so for me, it was a long journey. But I think if the person posing the question avails themselves of all these services, I just am so certain that their journey will be much, much shorter than mine was. And then, of course, they'll be well or stay living well with bipolar disorder, and they won't have lost years. I don't think the lost years are an absolute.
Mm.